He never raised his voice. That was the first thing the army nurse would remember long after the bruises faded and the police reports were forgotten. Even as four young men spread across the empty sidewalk outside the military base, smiling with the careless confidence of people who believed they had already won, the stranger behind her remained silent. The morning air carried the smell of warm asphalt, diesel fuel, and the sharp scent of antiseptic that still clung to her uniform after 14 relentless hours inside the emergency ward. Captain Emily Carter tightened her grip on the canvas medical bag hanging from her shoulder. Every muscle in her body ached from exhaustion. She had spent the night fighting to keep wounded soldiers alive after a training accident, skipping meals, ignoring her own fatigue, and comforting frightened families whose lives had changed before sunrise. Now, only a few hundred yards beyond the security gate, she faced a different kind of danger. One without uniforms. One without rules. The military installation behind her stood secure beneath rows of surveillance cameras and disciplined guards, but the public road outside belonged to everyone. The morning traffic had thinned. A delivery truck rolled past without slowing. A cyclist glanced toward the confrontation before looking away. The world had mastered the art of pretending not to notice someone else's problem. The tallest member of the group stepped into her path, a grin spreading across his face with practiced arrogance. He looked barely 23, wearing expensive sneakers already stained with dirt and a leather jacket despite the growing heat. His confidence rested not in his own strength but in the three friends flanking him. Together they formed a loose wall that left Emily nowhere to walk except backward. She stopped. Her heartbeat quickened, but her expression remained composed. Years in military medicine had taught her that panic rarely solved emergencies. Calm minds saved lives. Sometimes they saved their own. The young man looked at the insignia on her uniform and laughed. He made a mocking remark about soldiers believing they owned the streets. Another reached toward the medical bag resting against her side, joking that military supplies sold for good money online. Emily shifted the bag behind her without saying a word. Inside were trauma dressings, medication, and personal notes about patients whose privacy she had sworn to protect. They saw only something worth stealing. She saw promises that could never be broken. One of them circled behind her, deliberately invading the small space people instinctively protect around themselves. Another pulled out his phone, amused by the possibility of recording whatever happened next. None of them appeared drunk. None looked desperate. That somehow made this situation worse. Cruelty chosen freely carried a colder weight than cruelty born from desperation. Emily measured the distance back to the gate. Too far. The guards would not notice unless someone shouted, and shouting might provoke exactly what she hoped to avoid. She inhaled slowly, remembering the breathing technique taught during combat casualty training. Control your breathing. Control your decisions. Control what you still can. Her father had taught her the same lesson years before she ever wore a uniform. He had served as an army medic until illness claimed him shortly after retirement. Whenever life became frightening, he would smile gently and say that courage was rarely about feeling fearless. It was about deciding what fear would not be allowed to steal. Emily still carried that lesson every day. Hidden beneath the sleeve of her uniform rested a faded woven bracelet he had tied around her wrist before her commissioning ceremony. The threads had begun to fray with age, but she refused to remove it. It reminded her that strength could be quiet. The tallest man leaned closer, invading her personal space until she could smell stale tobacco beneath expensive cologne. His smile never reached his eyes. He asked whether anyone would miss one army nurse if she disappeared for a few hours. His friends laughed with the lazy confidence of spectators who believed consequences belonged only to other people. Emily met his gaze without flinching. She spoke softly, telling them to move aside so everyone could leave without making a mistake that would change lives forever. Her voice carried no anger. No insults. Only firm dignity. For a brief second uncertainty crossed the young man's face. Bullies expected fear. They understood shouting. Calm unsettled them because it reflected their own instability back at them. But pride quickly buried hesitation. He stepped even closer. Behind Emily, near the edge of a weathered bus stop, stood a man who looked entirely forgettable. He wore faded jeans, worn hiking boots, and a plain gray jacket despite the warm morning. His hair carried streaks of early gray. A travel mug rested loosely in one hand while the other remained inside his jacket pocket. Nothing about him invited attention. He appeared to be another commuter waiting for transportation after an ordinary morning. Yet his eyes never wandered. They remained fixed on the unfolding confrontation with quiet concentration. He had been there before Emily reached the sidewalk. He had watched the gang notice her. He had watched them spread out. He had watched every escape route disappear. There was something unusual about the way he stood. Relaxed, almost casual, yet perfectly balanced. His breathing never changed. His shoulders never tightened. People accustomed to violence often revealed themselves through nervous anticipation. This man revealed nothing. Emily noticed him only once, briefly, during a quick glance beyond the gang. What caught her attention was not his face but the faded green braided bracelet around his wrist. It looked handmade, old enough for its colors to have softened beneath years of sunlight. Something about it stirred an impossible feeling of familiarity she could not explain. Before she could think further, one member of the gang kicked her medical bag onto the pavement. The zipper burst partially open. Bandages spilled across the dusty sidewalk alongside a folded notebook and several sealed medical kits. The young men laughed again. Emily immediately knelt to protect the scattered supplies, instinctively placing patient care above her own pride. That simple act transformed the moment. She was no longer defending herself. She was protecting the people those supplies were meant to help. As she reached for the notebook, another shoe came down inches from her hand, deliberately blocking it. The tallest gang member smiled wider, enjoying the imbalance of power. He stretched one hand toward her shoulder as if claiming ownership over the next moment. The air seemed to stop moving. Even the distant traffic faded beneath the silence that settled across the empty road. Emily felt the shadow fall over her before she heard the footsteps. Slow. Steady. Unhurried. The ordinary man from the bus stop had finally begun walking toward them. He did not run. He did not shout. He simply placed himself between the gang and the kneeling army nurse with the calm certainty of someone who had already decided exactly how this story would end. Then, for the first time, he spoke. His voice was low, almost gentle. Leave her alone. That is the last easy decision you will make today. And for reasons none of them yet understood, every instinct inside the four young men suddenly whispered that the quiet stranger standing before them was the one person they should never have forced to take that single step. The four young men laughed together, but it was no longer the effortless laughter of people enjoying someone else's fear. There was uncertainty hiding beneath it now, the kind that appears when confidence collides with something it cannot immediately explain. The stranger stood between the army nurse and the gang with his hands resting loosely at his sides, his posture almost relaxed, as though he had interrupted nothing more serious than a disagreement between impatient commuters. Captain Emily Carter slowly rose from one knee, gathering the scattered medical supplies into her bag without taking her eyes completely off the men surrounding them. Her pulse still raced, yet the stranger's composure had become strangely contagious. It reminded her of surgeons she admired, people whose calm grew steadier as everyone else's panic increased. The tallest member of the gang stepped forward until only a few feet separated him from the newcomer. He looked the older man up and down, searching for something intimidating. He found faded boots, a plain gray jacket, weathered hands, and a face marked more by quiet experience than obvious strength. Nothing about him looked extraordinary. That ordinary appearance encouraged the gang. They mistook restraint for weakness, age for slowness, and silence for fear. It was a mistake made countless times before by people who judge danger only by appearances. One of the younger men sneered and demanded that the stranger mind his own business. Another laughed and suggested he walk away while he still could. The stranger neither smiled nor frowned. He simply looked at each of them in turn, not quickly, not dramatically, but carefully, as though memorizing every face for reasons known only to him. Emily noticed something peculiar. His eyes never lingered on their insults. Instead, they observed hands, feet, posture, breathing. He was not listening to what they said nearly as much as he was reading what they were preparing to do. Years of experience had taught him that violence always announced itself before the first blow. Shoulders tightened. Weight shifted. Eyes narrowed. Fear disguised itself as aggression. The stranger had learned that language long ago. He spoke again, his voice remaining calm enough to make the surrounding silence seem louder. He told them there was still time to leave. No one had been seriously hurt. No one's future needed to be destroyed over one foolish decision. He did not threaten them. He offered them dignity. For a heartbeat, the street became completely still. Even the breeze seemed to pause between the nearby trees. Emily watched the gang exchange uncertain glances. One looked away first. Another swallowed hard. Somewhere beneath their arrogance, the opportunity to walk away still existed. It was the last gift the stranger intended to give them. The tallest man rejected it. Pride can become a prison long before anyone notices the bars. He shoved the stranger hard in the chest, expecting him to stumble backward. Instead, nothing happened. The older man's boots remained planted exactly where they had been. His balance did not shift by even an inch. Surprise flashed across the young man's face before anger replaced it. He swung a wild punch aimed at the stranger's head. The movement lasted less than a second. The response lasted even less. Emily barely saw the motion. A slight turn of the shoulders. One controlled step. A firm redirection of the attacking arm. The young man's own momentum carried him harmlessly onto the pavement, where he landed face first, stunned more by confusion than pain. Before the others could process what had happened, another rushed forward. The stranger moved with astonishing precision. Every action was economical. No wasted effort. No unnecessary force. A wrist was redirected. A balance point was broken. Another attacker found himself sitting heavily against the curb, clutching his arm in disbelief rather than injury. The remaining two hesitated. For the first time, fear appeared openly on their faces. They had expected a fight. Instead, they had encountered complete control. The stranger did not chase them. He did not taunt them. He simply stood where he was, placing himself between them and Emily like an immovable wall. His breathing remained steady. His expression never changed. Emily had treated elite soldiers after combat operations. She had watched special operations teams move through hospital corridors with the same quiet confidence. Suddenly, the stranger's posture, awareness, and impossible calm made sense, though she still could not place exactly why. One of the gang members reached into his pocket. Emily's heartbeat jumped. The stranger noticed the movement before the hand even disappeared beneath the jacket. His voice became firmer, though never louder. "Don't." The single word carried such absolute certainty that the young man froze. Slowly, almost involuntarily, he removed an empty hand instead. No weapon appeared. The stranger had ended the decision before it could become irreversible. For several long seconds no one moved. The morning traffic continued beyond the intersection, unaware that lives had nearly changed forever on a forgotten stretch of sidewalk. Emily could hear only distant engines and the faint flutter of the flag above the military gate behind them. The silence settled over everyone like a heavy blanket. It was not an empty silence. It was the silence that follows when anger realizes it has already lost. Then came the sound of approaching sirens. Blue lights reflected across parked vehicles as military, police, and local officers arrived almost simultaneously. 2 MPs hurried toward the scene, prepared for another street disturbance. One of them slowed abruptly after seeing the stranger. His posture changed instantly. He stopped, stood straighter, and raised a crisp salute without hesitation. The second military policeman did exactly the same. Neither officer looked confused. They looked deeply respectful. "Good morning, Master Sergeant Walker," one of them said. "Are you all right, sir?" Emily looked from the saluting soldiers to the quiet man who had protected her without revealing anything about himself. Master Sergeant Walker acknowledged the salute with a small nod before calmly explaining exactly what had happened. He never exaggerated. He never insulted the young men. He even requested that medical attention be offered to the two who had fallen, despite the fact that they had started the confrontation themselves. Emily recognized that kind of compassion. It belonged to people who understood strength so completely that they no longer needed to prove it. As officers secured the gang, one local detective quietly approached Emily and asked whether she realized who had intervened on her behalf. She shook her head. The detective smiled faintly. The man standing a few yards away was not merely a retired soldier. He was a highly decorated Green Beret whose missions remained classified even after decades of service. More than once he had walked into places where others could not survive, and more than once he had carried wounded strangers home when no one expected anyone to return. Emily stared at the faded green bracelet wrapped around his wrist once more. Something deep inside her memory stirred, something connected to her late father, to stories never fully told, to a promise she had heard only once as a child. Before she could ask the question forming in her heart, Master Sergeant Walker slowly turned toward her, his eyes resting on the worn bracelet beneath her own sleeve, and a look of quiet recognition crossed his face, as though he had finally found the person he had been searching for all along. He looked at the faded bracelet on Emily's wrist for several long seconds before lifting his eyes to meet hers, and in that quiet exchange something passed between them that neither uniforms nor words could fully explain. Around them the military police finished escorting the young men toward waiting vehicles, their earlier confidence replaced by stunned silence. The flashing lights reflected across the pavement, but the noise of the arrest seemed strangely distant now, as if the morning itself understood that the real story had only just begun. Master Sergeant Daniel Walker stepped closer, his expression carrying neither triumph nor resentment. He had not come seeking recognition. In truth, he had spent years avoiding it. His gaze rested on the weathered threads around Emily's wrist, and for the first time since leaving the bus stop, genuine emotion softened the discipline in his face. He asked her a simple question. Had her father ever spoken about a young Special Forces medic who refused to leave a wounded teammate behind during a mission that officially never happened? Emily felt the ground beneath her seem less certain. Her father had rarely spoken about combat. When he did, his stories were never about medals or victories. They were about ordinary acts of kindness performed under impossible circumstances. As a little girl, she had often asked why he kept an old green bracelet folded inside a wooden box beside his military photographs. He would smile, close the lid again, and say that someday someone would understand why it mattered. After he passed away, Emily had taken the matching bracelet he had tied around her wrist on the day she became an army nurse. She had never known there had been another one. Daniel slowly rolled back the sleeve of his jacket, revealing the bracelet Emily had noticed earlier. Though faded by decades of sunlight and rain, the weaving pattern was unmistakably identical. They had once been part of the same cord, separated years ago and carried by two people whose lives had continued on different paths without crossing again. Emily looked at him with widening eyes. Daniel nodded gently. More than 25 years earlier, her father had been the combat medic assigned to Daniel's Special Forces team during an operation deep inside hostile territory. The mission had gone catastrophically wrong. Communications failed. Extraction was delayed. Several soldiers were injured before they could reach safety. Daniel had suffered wounds that left him unable to walk, and enemy forces were closing in. Every tactical calculation suggested leaving him behind so the others might survive. But Emily's father refused. For hours he carried, dragged, and protected Daniel across unforgiving terrain, while bullets tore through trees and explosions shook the earth beneath their feet. Again and again Daniel had begged to be left behind. Again and again the medic answered with the same quiet words. No one goes home alone. Those words became more than encouragement. They became a promise that shaped the rest of Daniel's life. When rescue finally arrived, both men survived, though Emily's father rarely spoke of what he had endured. Daniel never forgot. Years later, when they prepared to return to different assignments, Emily's father divided a single handmade green bracelet into two matching pieces. One remained with him. The other he tied around Daniel's wrist. He told him that if either man ever had the chance to protect the other's family, he hoped they would do so without hesitation and without expecting gratitude. They shook hands, embraced as brothers, and walked in opposite directions. Life scattered them across different continents. Military careers ended. Families grew. Time quietly buried names beneath decades of ordinary living. Then illness claimed Emily's father before Daniel could find him again. For years Daniel searched for any trace of the medic who had saved his life. Eventually he discovered that the man's daughter had become an army nurse assigned to the same installation where her father had once served. He never intended to intrude on her life. He simply parked near the base several mornings each week, telling himself that if she ever needed help, even once, he would finally be able to honor the promise made so many years before. He had waited for months without speaking to her. Then this morning, he saw the gang surround her before she reached her car. The promise her father had made in a distant battlefield suddenly became his to keep. Emily felt tears gathering despite every lesson military discipline had taught her about controlling emotion. She realized that the stranger who had appeared at exactly the right moment had not been there by accident. Kindness, she understood, sometimes travels across decades before arriving precisely when it is needed most. One of the military police officers approached quietly, returning Emily's medical notebook that had been recovered from the sidewalk. Daniel accepted it first, brushing a little dust from the cover before handing it back with the same care one might show a treasured family photograph. His hands, shaped by years of service and sacrifice, handled it with remarkable gentleness. Emily thanked him, but the words felt too small for everything he had carried all those years. Daniel smiled softly. He told her that gratitude belonged to her father. He had simply been paying an old debt that could never truly be repaid. Emily shook her head. Some debts, she said, were never meant to be repaid. They were meant to be passed forward. Daniel's eyes brightened with quiet pride because those words sounded exactly like the man who had once refused to abandon him. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The morning sun climbed higher above the base, washing the concrete, the uniforms, and the fluttering flag in warm golden light. Soldiers continued reporting for duty. Nurses hurried toward another shift. Civilian life resumed as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet for Emily, the world had subtly changed. She no longer carried only her father's memory. She carried living proof that goodness survives in the lives it touches. Before leaving, Daniel removed the old bracelet from his wrist and gently placed it in Emily's hand beside her own. The two faded pieces rested together once again, completing a circle that had remained broken for a quarter of a century. He told her he no longer needed the reminder because the promise had finally been fulfilled. Then he turned and walked away with the same quiet humility that had marked every step since she first noticed him at the bus stop. He did not wait for applause. He did not look back. Some acts of courage seek witnesses. Others simply seek the chance to do what is right. Emily watched until he disappeared into the growing crowd, realizing that the strongest people are often the ones the world never notices until kindness reveals who they truly are. As she continued toward the hospital, the two bracelets rested safely in her pocket, gently touching with every step, carrying a message stronger than time itself. Courage is loud only when it must be. The rest of the time, it walks beside us in silence, keeping promises that no one else even knows exist. And perhaps that is why the greatest heroes are rarely the ones standing in the spotlight, but the ones quietly making sure someone else reaches home safely. If this story stayed with you, there are many more reminders that compassion can outlive fear, and another one is waiting the next time you return.